Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Get comfortable. Let the lights go low. Let the room go quiet around you. There is nothing you need to solve tonight, and nothing you need to carry any further than this pillow. Before we begin, a thank you. Tonight's story exists because of a listener named Greg, who left this idea in the comments. If you have an idea of your own, leave it in the comments. Every episode on this channel starts as somebody's stray thought at 2 a.m, and the best ones almost always arrive that way. We read them all. And while you're down there, tell us where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. It is one of our favourite things. Somewhere out there it is a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Somewhere it is just past midnight. Somewhere the sun has not come up yet, and somebody is putting this on before a night shift. Seeing how far this little community reaches is genuinely one of the nicest parts of doing this, so drop your city and your clock and go read a few of the others while you drift. Now, settle in. Tonight we are going deep. Not into a forest, not into a desert, not into a locked room in a quiet town. Tonight we're going down into cold black water, into the part of the world that has never once seen daylight, where the pressure is heavy enough to crush steel like a paper cup, and where the only thing that travels is sound. This is the story of a submarine called Scorpion, and the 99 men aboard her, and the noise that the ocean recorded on a spring afternoon in 1968. It is a story about listening, about two enormous nations spending decades with their ears pressed to the sea floor, each convinced the other was hiding something, and each one wrong in a way that neither could afford to admit. Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. We're going under. The spring of 1968 is not a gentle season anywhere in the world, and it is not a gentle season underwater either. Beneath the surface of the Atlantic, a quiet war is being fought without a single shot. American submarines shadow Soviet submarines. Soviet submarines shadow American ones. Nuclear missiles ride under the waves in steel tubes, moving slowly through the dark, and both sides spend enormous amounts of money and attention on a single question, repeated endlessly. Where are they right now? Where are they at this exact moment? Because the ocean is very large, and a submarine that cannot be found cannot be stopped. Into that world moves the United States ship Scorpion, hull number SSN 589. She's a skipjack-class attack submarine, nuclear-powered, teardrop-shaped, fast, and by the standards of her generation, very good at her job. She has been at sea for months. She has been operating in the Mediterranean, doing the sort of work that does not get written down in detail. And now, in the last week of May, she's going home. Home is Norfolk, Virginia. Home is a pier and a crowd, and wives and children and parents holding signs. Home is a haircut and a hot meal, and a bed that does not hum. The crew has been counting the days for weeks. Sailors do that. They start counting long before it is reasonable to start counting. There are 99 men aboard. Think about that number for a moment, because it is easy to let it slide past. 99. A small town's worth of people, sealed inside a steel cylinder about the length of a city block, breathing recycled air, sleeping in bunks stacked 3 high, eating together, arguing together, sharing a space so tight that a man learns the sound of his neighbour's cough and can tell it apart from anyone else's. They know each other in a way that people on land almost never do. Her commanding officer is Commander Francis Atwood Slattery. He's an experienced officer, well regarded, a man who has spent much of his career inside the quieter corners of undersea warfare, the parts of the service that do not hold press conferences. He is 36 years old. He has a wife and children waiting at Norfolk. The crossing should be straightforward. Point the boat west, run at a comfortable depth, and go home. But before Scorpion can start that run, new orders arrive. There is Soviet naval activity in the Atlantic, in the waters near the Canary Islands. A small group of ships, a submarine, a research vessel, some support craft. Nothing alarming, nothing that suggests a crisis, but the American Navy would like a closer look, and Scorpion is the boat that happens to be nearby, and so the boat that happens to be nearby is given the job. It is routine intelligence work. Observe, record, do not be seen, then continue home. She does it. She watches the Soviet group. She reports in. And on the evening of May 21st, 1968, Scorpion transmits a message saying she is finished, that she is proceeding toward Norfolk at an ordinary speed, and that she expects to arrive on the 27th. It is a perfectly normal message. There is nothing in it that anyone would remember, and nothing in it that anyone would keep, except that it turns out to be the last thing anyone ever hears from her. Somewhere on May 22nd, 1968, in deep water southwest of the Azores, the United States ship Scorpion stops existing. No distress call, no emergency buoy released, no oil slick found, no debris on the surface, no survivors. She simply does not arrive. Now hold on to that for a moment, because there is a strange and very human interval that follows, and it is the part of this story that always stays with me. On the morning of May 27th, the pier at Norfolk is crowded. It is raining. Families have been arriving since before dawn, the way families do, far too early, because nobody wants to be the one who missed the moment. There are children in their good clothes. There are mothers holding umbrellas over other people's children. There is a band. The Navy always sends a band. The expected arrival time comes and goes. At first, nobody worries. Submarines are late. Weather happens. Somebody says something about a delay and everyone laughs, because of course there is a delay. There is always a delay, and the rain gets heavier and the band stops playing and the children get restless. An hour passes, then another. By the middle of the afternoon, the officers on the pier have stopped making eye contact with the families. That is the moment. If you ask anyone who was there, that is the moment when the day turns. Not an announcement, not a siren, just a change in the way the men in uniform were standing. The families are eventually asked to go home. Most of them refuse for a while. Some stay until dark. And out in the Atlantic, the search begins. It is enormous. Ships, aircraft, patrols sweeping thousands of square miles of open water. They search the projected track. They search the alternate tracks. They search the places where a boat in trouble might have limped. They find fishing floats and weathered debris and the ordinary garbage of the sea, and they find nothing that belongs to Scorpion. Publicly, the Navy is careful. On the 5th of June, Scorpion is officially declared presumed lost. The families receive their letters. The flags are folded symbolically for a burial with no bodies to bury. Privately, something else is already happening, and it is happening quietly, in windowless rooms, weeks before the public knows anything at all. Because the United States has been keeping a secret in the ocean. Its name is SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System, and in 1968, almost nobody outside a very small circle knows it exists. It is a network of hydrophones, listening devices, laid across the sea floor of the North Atlantic and the Pacific, wired back to shore stations, humming away 24 hours a day. It was built to hear Soviet submarines. It was built because sound is the one thing that travels well in deep water, and because a submarine can hide from radar and satellites and eyes, but it cannot easily stop making noise. SOSUS does not listen selectively. It listens to everything. Whales, earthquakes, ice, storms, ships, propellers. Every rumble and click and groan of an entire ocean, recorded onto reels of magnetic tape, day after day after day, in quantities no human being could ever fully review. Which means that if the Scorpion died in the North Atlantic, there is a real chance that the ocean itself heard it happen, and somebody is going to have to go and find that moment on the tape. That somebody, in our story, is a lieutenant named Ellis Vandry. He is 27 years old. He is an acoustic analyst, which in 1968 is a job that almost nobody understands, including most of the Navy. He does not command anything. He does not go to sea. He sits in a low, cold room with a set of headphones and a bank of tape machines and an oscilloscope, and he listens to recordings of water for 8 or 9 or 11 hours at a stretch. It is not glamorous work, and he is very good at it. Vandry grew up in a small town in Vermont, the son of a piano tuner, which is a detail he almost never mentions but which explains more about him than anything on his service record. He grew up in a house where his father would strike a note and then hold up one finger, and the whole family would go silent, and the note would hang there in the air until it faded completely, and only then would anyone be allowed to speak. He learned before he was 10 years old that most people do not actually listen to sound. They listen for a moment and then they decide what the sound is, and then they stop listening and go on hearing their decision instead. Vandry never learned to stop listening. It is the thing that makes him excellent at his job, and it is also, eventually, the thing that ruins his life. By 1968, he can tell a Soviet submarine from an American one by the specific rhythm of a slightly damaged propeller blade. He can hear the difference between a whale and a ship. He can hear a distant undersea landslide and estimate how far away it was. He knows the ocean the way an old farmer knows weather, not as data but as a language. In early June of 1968, Vandry is told to report to a room he has never been to before, and he is given an assignment with no explanation attached to it. Find the moment. Somewhere in these tapes, between certain dates and certain coordinates, there is an event. Find it, characterize it, and locate it. Do not discuss the assignment with anyone, including the people you work with every day. He does not need to be told what he is looking for. Everyone in the building already knows a submarine is missing. Nobody says the name out loud, but everyone knows. So he begins. The work is slow in a way that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not done it. He listens to hours of nothing. The deep ocean is not silent. It is full of an endless soft roar, a kind of grey weather made of sound. And inside that roar are the things that matter, and they are usually very small. He runs tapes forward. He runs them back. He plays the same 11 seconds 40 times in a row, at different speeds, watching the trace jump on the screen. He drinks a great deal of coffee. He stops going home for dinner. His wife, Nadine, leaves plates in the icebox with notes on them, and after a while she stops writing the notes. On the fourth day, he finds it. There, on tape from more than one listening array, separated by hundreds of miles, is a sequence. It is unmistakable once you have found it, and nearly invisible until you do. A sharp initial event, then a pause, then a long, complicated series of collapses, each one heavy and low, arriving in a rhythm that anyone in that room could interpret without being told. That is a hull. That is a submarine sinking past its crush depth, and the compartments giving way one after another as the pressure finds them, each failure a separate sound, spaced apart by the seconds it takes to fall. Vandry has heard test data. He has heard recordings of scuttled hulls. He has never heard this. This is the actual thing, and it lasts about 3 minutes, and at the end of it there is nothing but the ordinary grey roar of the Atlantic again, exactly as it was before, as though nothing had happened at all. He takes off his headphones. He sits for a long time. Then he does the arithmetic, because that is the job. Using the arrival times at the separate arrays, he triangulates a position. Deep water, southwest of the Azores, hundreds of nautical miles from anywhere. He writes it down. He checks it. He writes it down again. He has just done something extraordinary. He has found a submarine in an entire ocean, using nothing but sound, months before anyone could go and look. The position he calculates will turn out to be very nearly exact. His assignment is finished. He should stop here. And this is the part where the story turns, because Ellis Vandry does not stop. For the simple and unglamorous reason that a piano tuner's son does not stop listening when the note is still hanging in the air. Before he writes his report, he does something nobody asked him to do. He winds the tape backward, past the event, into the ordinary time before it, and he listens to what the ocean sounded like in the minutes leading up to the end of Scorpion, and about a minute and a half before the first sharp event he finds something else. It is faint, it is narrow, it is a tone, or something like a tone, high and thin and very pure, without the messy edges that machinery has. It does not sound like a propeller. It does not sound like biology. It does not sound like ice or rock or storm. And it moves. He tracks it across the arrays. He plots it. He checks his numbers because the numbers are wrong. He checks them again, and then a third time, on a different day, with a fresh head and better coffee, and the numbers stay wrong in exactly the same way. Whatever generated that sound crossed a very large distance in a very short time. Not slightly faster than a submarine. Not impressively faster. Faster in a way that does not fit inside the category of things that move through water. Faster than any vessel any nation on Earth is known to possess. Faster than the shape of the ocean should reasonably permit for something that size. And there is one more thing, and this is the detail that will follow Vandry for the next 24 years of his life. The contact is not moving away from Scorpion. It is out ahead of her, and Scorpion, according to the acoustic reconstruction, is not continuing on a straight, ordinary run toward Norfolk at all. Sometime in the final hour she alters course, she turns, she comes off her homeward heading, and she moves toward the position of the unidentified contact, and she is still moving toward it when the recording ends. That is not the behaviour of a submarine that was ambushed. That is the behaviour of a submarine that was following something. Vandry writes it all up. Both events, the loss and the thing before the loss. He includes his numbers, his methodology, the array data, the whole careful architecture of an honest analyst's argument. He is proud of it, in a quiet way. He has done difficult work well. He carries the report to his superior, a captain in our story named Aldous Renner. Renner is a large, tired, courteous man in his 50s, one of those officers who has clearly been extremely good at something for a very long time and has stopped enjoying it. He reads the first section about the loss with real attention and asks 2 intelligent questions and nods and says quietly that this is fine work and that it will save the search fleet a great deal of time. Then he turns the page and reads the second section. He does not react at all. That is the thing Vandry remembers later, more than any of the words. He does not frown. He does not lean forward. He reads it the way a man reads a document he has read before. Then Renner closes the folder, and he says, without looking up, that Vandry has misidentified a Soviet vessel. There is a Soviet naval presence in that region. It is a Soviet boat, some new class perhaps, some propulsion configuration they have not catalogued, and the speed calculation is an artifact of poor bearing resolution across widely separated arrays. He explains it well. He is not condescending about it. It is, on the face of it, a perfectly reasonable explanation, and it is exactly the explanation Vandry himself considered first. And then Renner asks for the tape, not the report. The tape. The original reel. Vandry hands it over, because he is 27 years old and a lieutenant, and the man asking is a captain. Renner puts it in his desk drawer, and he tells Vandry that he is not to raise the matter again, not in writing, not in conversation, not with colleagues, not with anyone. The second section of the report will not be filed. As far as the record is concerned, it does not exist. And then Renner says one more thing, and he says it almost kindly, which somehow makes it worse. He says, "You found them. That is what you were asked to do. Let that be the thing you did." Vandry walks out into the corridor and stands there for a while. Here is what he cannot get past, and it is not the speed, and it is not the tone, and it is not even the draw. It is that Renner never asked him a single question about it. A senior officer presented with an unexplained high-speed underwater contact appearing 90 seconds before the loss of an American nuclear submarine did not ask what frequency it was, or what bearing, or whether it had been seen before. You do not fail to ask those questions because you are not interested. You fail to ask them because you already know the answers. There is one detail Vandry does not mention in that corridor, and does not mention to anyone for another 24 years. Weeks earlier, on the first day of the assignment, he had done what he always did with a tape he expected to spend a long time inside of. He made a working duplicate so that the original would not be worn down by hundreds of passes across the heads. It was routine. It was so routine that he did not log it, because nobody logged it, because it was the same as sharpening a pencil. The duplicate is in a metal canister on a shelf in his own workspace, among 40 other canisters, labelled with a date and a station code and nothing else. He leaves it exactly where it is. He does not touch it for years. He simply knows it is there, the way you know there is a door in a wall behind you. Now, while Vandry is being told to forget, the rest of the Navy is doing something remarkable, and it is worth slowing down for because it is one of the great feats of ocean searching in the 20th century. Through the summer of 1968, a research ship called Mizarte's camera sleds and magnetometers back and forth across the deep Atlantic, in an area the acoustic analysis has narrowed down for them. This is not like searching a field. The water there is more than 2 miles deep. The sleds fly a few dozen feet above a seafloor no one has ever seen, in absolute darkness, photographing mud and more mud, frame after frame after frame, thousands of frames of empty grey sediment. And on the 28th of October 1968, a camera passes over something that is not mud. The photographs come back and there she is, Scorpion, or what the ocean has left of her, resting in soft sediment more than 10,000 feet down, roughly 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores. She is broken. The bow section lies apart from the rest. The great cylinder of the operations compartment has been driven into the after section, like a fist into a paper bag, telescoped by pressure, a piece of engineering violence that is difficult to look at even in a black and white photograph 50 years later. The stern lies separately. Debris is scattered across the sea floor in a long thin field. Everything about the wreck says the same thing. This submarine went below her crush depth, and the Atlantic took her apart. But that only tells you how she died. It does not tell you why she went down there in the first place. And this is where the official story enters the long, grey, unresolved corridor it still occupies today. A court of inquiry is convened. Serious people examine everything, and the theories multiply, because every one of them is plausible and none of them can be proven. Perhaps it was a torpedo. There is a hypothesis, seriously considered, that a Mark 37 torpedo inside the boat activated by accident, that its battery overheated in the tube, that it either exploded internally or was fired away and then, following its own logic, turned around and came back for the nearest thing that looked like a target, which was the submarine that launched it. Perhaps it was the trash disposal unit, a hatch to the sea that could flood the boat if it failed. Perhaps it was a battery explosion. Perhaps a seawater pipe failure. Perhaps a hydrogen build-up. Perhaps a mechanical casualty in the propulsion plant that cost her power and depth control in the same minute. And underneath all of it is a fact that makes every theory sting. Scorpion was tired. She had been run very hard for years. She'd gone into an overhaul that was cut short for operational reasons, emerging without some of the safety upgrades her sister boats received after the loss of Thresher 5 years earlier. Men who served aboard her had raised concerns. There were leaks. There were vibrations. There was a freon leak. There was a hydraulic problem. Sailors called her, among themselves in the way sailors do, by names that were not affectionate. So the official answer, when it finally settles, is a shrug in the shape of a document. The cause could not be ascertained. Something went wrong aboard a worn-out submarine far from help in deep water, and 99 men died in about 3 minutes. For most people, that is where the story ends. A mechanical tragedy, a sad footnote. For Ellis Vandry, sitting in a cold room with a shelf full of tape canisters, it is not an answer at all, because the official version contains no explanation whatsoever for the 2 things he personally measured. It does not explain the contact, and it does not explain the turn. A worn-out submarine can suffer a torpedo accident, certainly, but a worn-out submarine does not, on its own, break off a homeward run and steer toward an unidentified object 90 seconds before it dies. Machinery does not make navigational decisions. Somebody in that control room gave an order, and Vandry cannot think of a single innocent reason why that order would be scrubbed from the story. So he starts building a different explanation. And because he is a rational man in 1968, and because the world he lives in has exactly one villain in it, he builds the explanation everyone in his position would build. He decides the Soviets did it. And here is the thing about that theory. It is good. It is genuinely, uncomfortably good. And by the middle of the 1970s, Vandry has assembled a version of it that could keep a reasonable person awake. It starts with another submarine. On the 8th of March, 1968, 11 weeks before Scorpion dies, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine designated K-129 sinks in the Pacific Ocean, northwest of Hawaii, with her entire crew. She's carrying nuclear weapons. The Soviet Navy launches an enormous search and cannot find her. The United States, using its own sound surveillance network, quietly can. What follows becomes one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War. Years later, the Central Intelligence Agency will build an entire ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, disguised as a deep ocean mining vessel financed by a famously reclusive billionaire, sail it out over the wreck, and attempt to lift a Soviet submarine off the floor of the Pacific from 3 miles down. The project is called Azorian. It partially succeeds and partially fails, and when journalists eventually ask about it, the government responds with a phrase so useful it enters the language permanently, the refusal to confirm or deny. Vandry does not know the details in 1968. Almost nobody does, but he knows enough. He knows American intelligence is intensely, unusually interested in a Soviet submarine that has just sunk, and he knows something else that is far more dangerous. He knows that some analysts are worried the Soviets might believe the Americans sank it. Sit with that for a moment, in the dark, and you will feel the shape of the fear. 2 nuclear-armed navies. 1 Soviet submarine lost in March under unexplained circumstances. 1 American submarine lost in May under unexplained circumstances, 11 weeks apart. And on each side, a room full of people asking the same question about the other. Vandry's theory assembles itself almost without effort. The Soviets concluded the United States destroyed K-129. They wanted a response that was proportionate, deniable and permanent. They found Scorpion. They killed her in deep water where nothing surfaces and nothing is recovered, and both governments, staring at the alternative, agreed without ever agreeing to call it an accident. And in 1985, the theory gets its final terrible support beam. That is the year the United States arrests John Anthony Walker Jr., a Navy communications specialist who had been selling cryptographic material to the Soviet Union since the 1960s. Walker gave Moscow the ability to read enormous quantities of American naval message traffic. He compromised the movements of ships and submarines on a scale that senior officers described, once the extent was understood, in language usually reserved for natural disasters. Vandry, by then a civilian, reads about the Walker case in a newspaper at his kitchen table and puts his coffee down, because his theory had always had one hole in it. The Atlantic is very large. To kill a specific submarine in it, you must first know where that submarine is going to be. And now there is an answer. Somebody was selling exactly that. For almost 20 years, that is the shape of the secret in Ellis Vandry's head. He is certain of it. He has stopped talking about it out loud because talking about it cost him a career already. But he is certain. He retired at 40. He teaches acoustics part-time at a small technical college. He and Nadine live in a house near the water in Maine because he could not stand to live anywhere else. And every so often, on nights when the wind is right, he goes down to the shore and stands there listening to it the way other men look at photographs. He is 51 years old, and the Cold War is ending on television, and he assumes he already knows how his story finishes. He is wrong. In the autumn of 1992, a man writes him a letter. The envelope has a Russian stamp on it, and an American postmark, which is its own small mystery, and inside is a single page of very careful English. The writer introduces himself as a retired officer of Soviet naval intelligence named Arkady Petrovich Losev. He says he worked for many years with acoustic records of the Northern Fleet. He says he has recently been permitted, by circumstances he describes only as the disorder of his country, to travel. And then, in the third paragraph, he does something that stops Ellis Vandry's heart for a moment in his own front hallway. He describes the contact, not vaguely, specifically, the frequency band, the narrowness of the tone, the absence of propeller signature, the behaviour on the 22nd of May, 1968, details that were never published, details that were in a report which was never filed, taken from a tape that went into a drawer. The letter ends with a request to meet, and a sentence Vandry reads perhaps 30 times over the following 2 days. It says, "I have read your theory in the shape of your questions, and I must tell you before we meet, so that you will not waste the journey being polite. We did not sink your submarine." They meet in November, in a hotel restaurant in Halifax, Nova Scotia, chosen because it is roughly equidistant and because neither man particularly wants to explain a visa. Losev is 71. He is small and neat and extremely tired, with the specific tiredness of a man who spent his professional life being trusted with things and is now watching the institution that trusted him dissolve into auctions. He orders tea and does not drink it. He apologises twice for his English, which is better than he thinks. They spend the first hour circling each other, two old professionals establishing that the other is real. Vandry describes an array configuration. Losev corrects a detail, and the correction is right. Losev describes a Northern Fleet reporting format. Vandry recognises it from documents he was not supposed to have seen, and then Losev opens a paper folder, and the world quietly changes shape. Inside are photocopies, Soviet naval documents from the spring of 1968, some typed, some handwritten, all bearing the density of stamps and initials that any bureaucracy anywhere produces when it is nervous. Losev turns them around so Vandry can see, and points to a phrase that appears again and again. Object 7, Object 7. Vandry asks what it is, and Losev says, in a voice so flat it takes a moment to register, "We hoped, for 11 years, that it was yours." Here is what the documents say, unfolded across a restaurant table in Nova Scotia by a man who has waited a very long time to unfold them for somebody who would understand. Beginning in the late 1950s, Soviet acoustic stations and submarines in the North Atlantic and the Arctic began recording a category of contact they could not classify. Not one object, a behaviour, a signature. Something that appeared, was tracked briefly, and left. The characteristics are consistent across more than a decade of reports, and every one of them is wrong. It produced no cavitation. Any propeller at speed boils the water behind it into collapsing bubbles, and that is the loudest thing most vessels do. Object 7, at speeds that should have made a propeller scream, made almost nothing. Just the tone. It accelerated in ways that had no business happening in seawater. Water is heavy. Moving something large through it quickly requires monstrous power, and monstrous power is noisy and hot and visible. Object 7 changed speed the way a bird changes direction. It stopped, fully stopped, in deep water and remained motionless for long periods, which submarines cannot comfortably do. It changed depth rapidly, over thousands of feet, without the sounds of ballast. And sometimes, most unsettling of all, it did not leave. It simply stopped being detectable, without any of the acoustic markers of departure. One moment there was a contact, the next there was ocean. Soviet analysts being sensible. People in a system that punished imagination assumed for years that they were tracking an American program. Something extraordinary out of a laboratory. It was the only explanation that did not end a career. And then, gradually, they noticed something that ruined it. American submarines were chasing it too, you can see it in the records. A Soviet boat tracking Object 7, and tracking, on another bearing, an American attack submarine that is very obviously working the same contact, with all the concentration of a hunter who thinks he is the only one in the woods. Losev says the argument inside his own service went on for years, and that the men who insisted the Americans were staging elaborate theatre for Soviet benefit eventually ran out of ways to explain why the theatre continued when there was no audience. By the middle of the 1960s, the Soviet position had quietly become the only position the evidence supported, and it was a deeply uncomfortable one. Object 7 was not American, it was not Soviet, and nobody had any idea what it was. They gave it the least interesting name they could invent, because a boring name attracts fewer questions from above. Unidentified submerged phenomenon. Vandry sits there with his hands flat on the table, and he tells Losev that the Americans had a designation too. He had seen it exactly once, on a routing slip he was not meant to read, in 1969, and had never seen it again. Submerged Contact Alpha. The two men look at each other for a while, and there it is, the great, absurd, entirely human irony at the centre of this whole story. Two enormous nations, at the peak of their fear of one another, spending fortunes and careers and decades chasing the same unexplained thing across the bottom of the world, each one convinced it belonged to the other, each one hiding the search from the other with total success, and each one therefore guaranteeing that the other's suspicion was never corrected. They were not hiding the phenomenon from the world, they were hiding it from the only other people on the planet who could have told them what it was not. Then Losev turns to the last few pages, and his manner changes. He stops explaining. He puts his finger on a line and leaves it there. It is a Northern Fleet operational log entry, dated the 22nd of May 1968. It records the detection of Object 7 in the Atlantic, in a position Vandry recognises immediately, because he calculated it himself 24 years earlier in a cold room with a headache. It records the approach of an unidentified American submarine toward that position, and it records an instruction transmitted to Soviet vessels in the area, which Losev translates aloud, slowly, twice. American vessel approaching Object 7, maintain distance, do not interfere, not intercept, not shadow, not report and stand by for orders, maintain distance. Vandry asks the obvious question, why? Why, at the height of the Cold War, would Soviet commanders order their own ships to back away from an American nuclear submarine doing something extraordinary right in front of them? And Losev says the standing instruction had existed since 1964, and that it existed because of what had happened to men who did not follow it. There were 3 incidents, Losev says, and he does not need the folder to describe them. In 1961, a Soviet diesel boat in the Barents Sea tracked a contact beneath her for nearly 40 minutes. When the captain descended to close the range, the object rose to meet him. Not away, toward. Every compass aboard the submarine swung at the same instant, all of them, together, and then swung back. The contact left. The captain wrote an honest report and was quietly moved to shore duty within the year. In 1963, north of the Faroe Islands, a crew reported a total loss of electrical power lasting somewhere between 11 and 19 seconds, depending on which man you asked, while a contact passed beneath them at close range. The boat surfaced. Everything worked again. Nothing was ever found wrong with any system aboard. And in 1964 there was an event Losev will not fully describe, then or ever. He says only that a submarine attempted a sustained, aggressive, close-range pursuit of Object 7 in the Norwegian Sea, that the pursuit lasted several hours, and that the boat returned to port with damage. That the shipyard could not attribute to any cause, and with a crew who were interviewed individually for 11 days. After that, the standing instruction was written. Do not close. Do not pursue. Observe from distance and disengage. Losev is very careful about what he says next, and Vandry never forgets the care. He says the Soviet Navy did not conclude that Object 7 was hostile. In more than a decade of records, there is no confirmed instance of it attacking anything. It never fired. It never rammed. It never behaved with anything a human being would recognize as aggression. But it reacted. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. When you tracked it passively, it usually went away. When you pursued it hard, it came to you. When you pinged it, It did something that made grown men stop sleeping. The instruction was not written out of fear of an enemy. It was written out of the ordinary caution a person uses around something very large in the dark, which has not hurt anyone yet, and which is clearly aware of being looked at. The two men agree to compare their oceans. It takes them the better part of a year, conducted by letter and by 2 more meetings, and it is the strangest collaboration of either man's life. Vandry goes up into his attic and brings down a canister he has not opened since the Johnson administration, and holds it for a while before he opens it, and finds that the tape inside is still good. Between them, working from 2 nations' recordings of the same afternoon, they assemble a single timeline of the 22nd of May, 1968, and it fits together with a precision that neither of them enjoys. First, Object 7 is present, moving slowly, in deep water southwest of the Azores. Then Scorpion, on a homeward heading, alters course toward it and increases speed. Then, for roughly 40 minutes, an American nuclear submarine closes the range on an unidentified submerged phenomenon, while Soviet vessels stand off and watch and write everything down and do not interfere. Then there is a change in Scorpion's behaviour. She goes active. She pings. On the Soviet log it is noted as an American vessel illuminating the contact. 3 transmissions spaced. Then, on both nations' tapes, 90 seconds before the end, Object 7 does something. There is a burst of acoustic energy. It is short. It is not an explosion. Losev's analysts had characterized it, in 1968, as an energetic event of undetermined origin, which is bureaucratic language for we do not know, and we would like to keep our jobs. And then, after the burst, come the sounds that Ellis Vandry found on his 4th day of work when he was 27 years old. The sharp initial event, the pause, the long, terrible cascade of collapsing compartments, spaced apart by the seconds it takes for a ship to fall. And then, for a little under 4 minutes afterward, Object 7 is still there, in the same area, motionless. And then it is not. 2 old men sat with that timeline for a long time, in 2 different countries, and neither of them could make it mean the thing they wanted it to mean. Because here is the honest problem, and Vandry, to his enormous credit, states it in his own notes before Losev has to state it for him. Nothing in that sequence proves Object 7 destroyed the Scorpion. The burst is not powerful enough to break a hull, and the hull did not break the way an attack breaks a hull. The wreck says pressure, not weapon. The wreck says a submarine that lost the ability to hold her depth and went down past the point where steel gives up. That could have been a torpedo casualty. It could have been flooding. It could have been an electrical fire in the wrong compartment at the wrong moment aboard a boat that was already tired and already overdue for care. It could, in other words, have been exactly the ordinary mechanical heartbreaking accident that the court of inquiry could not quite name. But if that is true, then the question is not what killed her. The question is what she was doing there. Because a mechanical failure is a random event, and random events happen wherever a ship happens to be. And this one happened while an American nuclear submarine, off her homeward track at speed, was closing on the single most sensitive, unexplained object either superpower had ever recorded, and pinging it. That is not a coincidence you can file, and it means that whatever the specific mechanism of her death, 99 men were in that particular patch of ocean, at that particular depth, doing that particular thing, because somebody ordered it. So Vandry spends the next 2 years trying to find the order. He is 62 years old. He has time, and a pension, and a lifetime of contacts among men who are now also old and also retired and also, some of them, tired of carrying things. He writes letters. He drives to towns in Virginia and Connecticut and Rhode Island, and sits in kitchens with men in cardigans and lets them talk about anything they like for 2 hours before he asks about anything at all. And in 1995, a widow in Maryland gives him a shoebox. Her husband had been a junior staff officer at Norfolk in 1968, and he had died the previous spring, and she had been going through the garage. There are photographs in the box. Christmas cards, and there is a manila envelope of onion skin carbon copies which, she says, her husband had never explained, and which she had never asked about because she had learned early in the marriage which questions produce silence. Most of it is routine, message traffic, signal formats, administrative debris. But one page is a fragment of an operational tasking, and the sequence numbers are for the last patrol of the Scorpion. The body of it is exactly what history already knows. Proceed to the vicinity of the Canary Islands, observe Soviet units, record, do not be detected, then proceed to Norfolk, and then, at the bottom, in a different hand, in pen, is an addendum. It is 4 lines long. It designates a corridor of the Atlantic by coordinates, and it instructs that in the event of the detection of an unidentified submerged contact within that corridor, the contact is to be closed to the minimum safe range, and photographic, acoustic, and radiological data are to be obtained. And it carries an origin marking Vandry has seen only twice in his life. Not a fleet, not an office anyone can find in a directory. Section Delta. He knows what it is, in outline, because he spent 4 years working alongside its shadow without ever being told its name. A very small compartment inside naval intelligence, whose entire function was to collect and hold unexplained undersea acoustic events. Not to investigate them, not to solve them, to collect them and to keep them, and to make sure that nobody else assembled the same pattern. Section Delta did not tell the Scorpion what Object 7 was. Section Delta did not tell the Scorpion what had happened to a Soviet boat in the Norwegian Sea in 1964, or that another navy had a standing order to stay away, or that 7 American submarines had already logged similar contacts and had their tapes collected. Section Delta told a commanding officer to go and get photographs, and that, in the end, is the true shape of the thing. Not a weapon, not a murder, not an ambush, a tasking written by men in a building handed to men in a boat, describing a job the men in the boat had no way of understanding. 99 sailors went home the long way because a 4-line addendum in pen said that if they saw something, they should go closer. Vandry finds one more witness, and it is the last piece, and it is the one that changes the story from a Cold War tragedy into something else entirely. His name is Owen Trask. In 1966, he was a sonar technician aboard an American attack submarine in the North Atlantic, and by 1996 he is a retired chief petty officer with a bad hip, living outside Groton, Connecticut, in a house with a wood stove and a very old dog. He does not want to talk. Then he talks for 6 hours. He describes a contact that came up beneath them during a routine transit. Enormous, he says, on the display. And silent in a way that made the whole watch go quiet, because there was no propeller, no cavitation, no plant noise, none of the mechanical grammar that every man-made object in the ocean is required to have. Just a tone, thin and pure and steady, like somebody holding a note on a wet glass. Their captain, who Trask describes with real affection as a man who had never once in his life declined an invitation, turned to follow it, and it went up. Trask says it climbed several thousand feet in less time than it should have taken to do anything at all, and then it stopped, dead still, directly beneath their keel and held station. There, while the submarine moved, he says the compasses went, all of them, at once, the same way, the way iron filings turn when you put a magnet under the paper. He says nobody spoke for a long moment, and then the captain said, in a very level voice, that they would resume base course, and they did. And after a few minutes the contact was gone. Not away. Gone. When they returned to port, the entire sonar watch was taken off the boat and interviewed separately by men in civilian clothes. Their tapes were removed, nothing was ever returned, and the incident does not appear in any log Trask ever saw again. Vandry asks him what the interviewers wanted to know, and Trask says the questions were mostly what you would expect. Bearings, ranges, depths, whether anybody had touched anything they shouldn't have, except for one. He says one of them, a quiet man who had not spoken for the first hour, waited until the end, and then asked a question Trask has thought about every few weeks for 30 years, without ever knowing why it was asked. he asked. "Did it imitate you?" Trask says he did not understand the question. He said no. The man wrote something down and thanked him, and that was the end of it. Ellis Vandry drives back to Maine that night and does not stop and does not eat. He gets home at 3 in the morning and goes into the room where he keeps his equipment and takes down the canister and threads the tape. He has listened to this recording perhaps 200 times across 28 years, and he has always listened to it the same way, which is the way he was trained. He has listened forward. He has listened for causes preceding effects. Tonight he does something he has never done, because until this evening nobody had ever suggested the idea to him. He takes the 3 sonar transmissions that Scorpion sent out 90 seconds before her end. 3 pulses, a spacing, a pattern. And then he goes to the acoustic burst that Object 7 produced in reply, the energetic event of undetermined origin, the sound that 2 navies filed and forgot because it was not an explosion and therefore was not interesting. And he slows it down, and he stretches it, and he looks at the shape of it on the screen rather than listening for what it might be. It is 3 pulses, the same spacing, the same interval, the same pattern, returned. Not an attack, not a weapon, not a warning, an answer. The thing that Scorpion had gone to look at had repeated the submarine's own sonar back to her, 90 seconds before she died, and for 28 years 2 of the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus on Earth had listened to that recording and heard only noise, because neither of them had ever once considered that it might be a reply. And somebody, in a room in 1966, had already thought of it. Somebody had already sat across a table from a frightened sailor and asked, "Did it imitate you?" Which means the question was not new. Which means somebody, somewhere, had heard it happen before. Vandry sits in that room until the sun comes up over the water. And the thing he keeps circling, the thing he will circle for the rest of his life, is not the physics of it. It is much simpler and much worse than physics. The unexplained contacts do not behave like machinery. Machinery does not notice. Machinery does not respond to the specific act of being detected. These contacts appeared when submarines were quiet. They left when submarines were passive. They approached when submarines pursued. They interfered with electrical systems at close range. And at least once, when spoken to, they spoke back. They were not hunting anyone. There is no evidence in 30 years of 2 nations' records that any of them ever deliberately harmed a single human being. But they were paying attention, and on the 22nd of May, 1968, a tired submarine with a worn-out hull and a crew who wanted to go home was ordered to drive up close to one of them and shine a light in its face. Perhaps the burst did something to her electrical systems, the way something did in the Barents Sea in 1961, and in a boat with known problems a few seconds of chaos at depth is all it takes. Perhaps the burst did nothing at all, and a torpedo battery chose that minute to fail, and the coincidence is simply the cruelest one in naval history. Vandry never claims to know. He's too good an analyst to claim to know. What he claims is narrower and harder to argue with. He claims the Navy could never tell the truth about how Scorpion died, because the truth would have required telling the families, and the Congress, and the world that 99 American sailors had been ordered to approach an object their own government could not identify, and had been quietly avoiding for years. Not a cover-up of an attack, a cover-up of a decision. And then there is the last connection, the one Losev brings to their final meeting in 1997, when he is 76 and unwell, and has stopped pretending he will get another chance to hand anything over. He has Pacific records now, fragments. The disorder of his country has become an opportunity for anyone patient and unashamed, and Losev has been both. In the week surrounding the 8th of March, 1968, in the region where K-129 was lost, Soviet stations recorded contacts with the characteristics of Object 7. Not one. Several. And that is where the whole Grand Cold War architecture of blame collapses into something much stranger and much lonelier. The United States did not sink K-129. the Soviet Union did not sink the Scorpion. 2 submarines, 11 weeks apart in 2 different oceans, may well have died of 2 entirely separate and entirely ordinary mechanical failures of the kind that happen to complicated machines run hard by tired men. But both of them died in water where their own governments were quietly, secretly, obsessively tracking the same unexplained phenomenon. And both governments, staring at their own classified files, discovered that they could not investigate the deaths honestly without revealing the surveillance. So each of them buried the loss inside the secret. And each of them assumed, for years, that the other had done it. Which brings us to the agreement. Losev calls it, with an old man's dry amusement, the thing that was never signed. In the story that Vandry eventually writes down and never publishes, it acquires a name, the Azores Protocol. Late in 1968, through back channels that had been built for arms control and were now being used for something no arms control negotiator would have believed, a small number of people on each side established 4 understandings: that unidentified deep ocean contacts would not be actively pursued beyond a stated distance, that acoustic data relating to them would be compartmentalized absolutely and would not be entered into any system that could be searched by pattern, that any incident involving them would be explained publicly through conventional causes wherever a conventional cause was even remotely available, and that neither nation would attempt to weaponize or exploit the phenomenon without informing the other. That 4th clause is the one Vandry finds most revealing, and the most human. 2 governments who trusted each other with nothing at all, who lied about grain harvest and missile counts and the weather, nevertheless agreed on one narrow point of etiquette, regarding a thing they could not name. Do not try to make it yours without telling me. They were not being noble, they were being terrified in the same direction at the same time, which is the closest those 2 nations ever came to friendship. And for 23 years, as far as either man can tell, the protocol held. Then the Soviet Union ended, and Vandry, who had spent a quarter of a century assuming that the truth was held shut by Soviet power, watched Soviet power evaporate entirely and waited for the truth to come out. It did not. Archives scattered. Officers retired into nothing. Programs were dissolved and files were sold and burned and lost. But the specific files did not appear. The specific files were absorbed, on both sides, quietly, into newer structures with newer names and newer classifications, the way a river absorbs a stream. And something else happened, in the 1990s and after, which Vandry considered the single most interesting fact of his entire professional life. The technology got better, enormously better. Sonar processing improved beyond anything he could have imagined in his cold room in 1968. Satellites improved, computers improved, deep ocean vehicles went places nobody had ever been. The ability of humanity to detect an unusual object in the sea increased by orders of magnitude, and the contacts got harder to find, not more numerous, as you would expect from better instruments, fewer, rarer, briefer, more marginal. Any sensible analyst would say the obvious thing, which is that better instruments simply reveal the old contacts to be misinterpretations, and that improved understanding dissolved a phenomenon which had only ever been an artifact of primitive equipment. Ellis Vandry, at 78, in a house near the water in Maine, wrote a different sentence in a notebook, and it is the last theory he ever recorded. He wrote, "They are not becoming harder to detect because we improved. They are becoming harder to detect because we improved." He meant it exactly the way it sounds. He meant that every advance in listening had been matched, and that the matching had been prompt, and that the only category of thing which grows quieter precisely as you grow better at hearing is a thing that is paying attention to how you are listening. He meant that for 50 years 2 nations had been studying an object, and that the object had been studying the study. Ellis Vandry died in 2011, at the age of 81, in the spring, at home. Arkady Losev had gone 11 years before him. Neither of them ever published anything. Vandry's notes went into a cardboard box, and the box went to a nephew, and the nephew put it in a basement in Portland, and there it sat. And the Atlantic went on doing what it has always done, which is to hold its temperature and turn slowly and keep everything. Now stay with me, because we are almost at the end, and the end takes place in the present. More than half a century after the loss, a civilian oceanographic survey vessel is working the deep water southwest of the Azores. She's called the Ardent Meridian, and her business is not military. She's mapping the seafloor at high resolution for a consortium of scientific institutions, running long straight survey lines back and forth, the way a person mows a very large and very dark lawn. Her chief scientist is a marine geophysicist named Imogen Vasari, and she is 44 years old, and she has been at sea for 19 days, and she is tired in the particular contented way of somebody whose work is going well. The survey grid includes the area around the wreck. It is not a secret place anymore. Its position is published. It is monitored occasionally for radiological release, and it has always been clean, and it is treated with the respect that all war graves are supposed to be treated with, and mostly are. So on a calm night, with the ship holding station, and the sea flat and black and enormous, they send a remotely operated vehicle down to have a careful look and to photograph the site for the record. The descent takes hours. That is the thing people never expect about deep water. There is nothing dramatic about it. You watch a screen showing nothing while a machine falls slowly through 2 miles of darkness, and the numbers change, and marine snow drifts up past the lights like the world's slowest blizzard, and everyone drinks tea and talks about other things. And then, at the bottom, the lights find her. She is not what you would call a submarine anymore. She's a long field of debris and soft grey sediment, and shapes that used to be a bow, and used to be a sail, and used to be a hull, softened by decades of a fine, patient dusting. There are anemones on the steel. There is a rat-tail fish that swims into the frame, entirely unimpressed, and swims out again. There is no sound at all in the control van. Everybody on that ship knows what they are looking at. 99 men are here, their names are known, and their ages are known, and the youngest of them was 19 years old. Vasari says a few words for the log, in the flat professional voice you use so that your voice will hold, and she does the sensible thing, which is to keep working. They fly a grid, they take their photographs, and a little after 2 in the morning, ship's time, an alert comes up on the sonar plot from a completely different system, one that is not looking at the wreck at all, but is doing the ship's ordinary business of watching the water around her. There is a contact roughly 2 miles from the wreck site. It is on the sea floor or just above it. It is compact. It is smooth. It returns sound in a way that is oddly clean, without the messy scatter of rock. They assume geology, because everybody always assumes geology. Because 99 times out of 100 it is geology. A boulder, an outcrop, a piece of something dropped from a ship 100 years ago. Vasari makes a note to run a line over it in the morning, because that is what you do with an anomaly, and she's thinking about her bunk. She's still standing there 10 minutes later, when the technician on watch says her name in a slightly different voice. The contact has moved, not drifted, not been replotted, moved several hundred meters in the time it took 2 people to have an unremarkable conversation about a boulder, and it is now off the seabed, holding depth, going nowhere in particular. Vasari asks for the passive array. They have one, because a survey ship always wants to know what is nearby. And what comes out of the water is not a propeller. It is not a plant. It is not a fishing vessel or a whale or a pipeline or a seismic source. It is a tone, thin and pure and steady, like somebody holding a note on a wet glass. It holds for perhaps 90 seconds, and then, before it goes, it does one more thing, and it is recorded, and the recording exists, and it is not classified, because civilian science vessels do not have a category for it. 3 pulses, a spacing, a pattern. The same 3 pulses with the same interval that an American submarine sent out into the dark southwest of the Azores on the 22nd of May, 1968, 90 seconds before she stopped existing. And then the water is just water again. For more than 50 years, whatever it was that Scorpion went to look at may never have gone very far from the place where she came to rest. Not trapped there. Nothing about it suggests trapped. Not hiding either. It has never seemed especially interested in hiding, only in leaving when it chooses to. Just there, in the dark. Above a field of broken steel, in cold water where nothing changes and nothing hurries, repeating 3 notes that a ship of 99 men once sang into the black, over and over, into a silence that has lasted longer than most of the people listening to this have been alive. So let me leave you with the shape of it, and then I will let you go to sleep. For half a century, the sinking of the Scorpion has been treated as one of the Cold War's great unanswered questions. Was it the torpedo? Was it the battery? Was it a worn-out boat that should have been in a shipyard? Was it Soviet revenge for a submarine the Soviets believed we had killed? Was it a spy in a communications office in Norfolk selling a schedule for money? And the strangest possibility, the one this story has been walking you toward, is not that all of those answers are wrong. Some of them may be perfectly right. Machinery fails. Tired ships die. A torpedo casualty in deep water needs no conspiracy to be a tragedy. The secret was never how she died. The secret was why she was there. 2 enormous nations spent 30 years chasing the same unexplained thing along the bottom of the world, each certain it belonged to the other, and each so committed to that certainty that neither could ever ask. And on a spring afternoon in 1968, a submarine full of men who were 6 days from home was ordered off her course by 4 lines written in pen by somebody who had never been to sea with them, and told that if she saw something she did not recognise, she should go closer. She went closer. She was not destroyed by something we do not understand. She was lost while trying to understand it, and the men aboard her never knew. That is the part that stays with me, not the object, and not the tone, and not the 3 pulses in the dark. It is 99 men doing their jobs well, on the last leg of a long deployment, thinking about their kitchens and their kids, and the drive home from the pier, following an order that made no sense to them because orders often do not, and being extremely good at a task that nobody ever explained. They deserved an explanation. They never got one, and neither did the people waiting in the rain at Norfolk on the 27th of May. But they are not forgotten. That is something. Sailors say the sea keeps what it takes, and that is true, but people keep things too. Names get read aloud. Stories get told at 2 a.m. to somebody who cannot sleep, in a country the crew never visited, in a year they never lived to see. So let the ocean go quiet now. Let the tone fade out. The way. Note fades when a piano tuner holds up one finger, and the whole room waits for the silence to come back. 2 miles down, the water is cold and still and completely dark, and it has been that way for a very long time. And it will be that way long after every one of us has stopped worrying about anything at all. There is a field of steel there, softening under a slow grey snow, and a grave that is properly looked after by the only thing large enough to look after it. And somewhere out beyond it, in water we have never really been able to see into, something is holding a note. It is not coming for you. It never was. It is just listening, the way it has always been listening, and tonight, so are you, and there is nothing left for either of you to do but drift. Before we begin, a huge thank you to Brandon for suggesting this one. Also, if you're listening on Spotify right now and you have not yet left a review, it takes about 10 seconds, and it genuinely helps this channel grow more than most people realise. Let's begin. There is a database that anyone in the world can access. No login, no clearance level, no restricted portal you need to know someone to reach. You simply open a browser, navigate to a government website, and the files are there, thousands upon thousands of them. Declassified intelligence documents from some of the most secretive programs in American history. It is called the Central Intelligence Agency Reading Room. Most people who visit it are curious researchers, journalists chasing threads, or history enthusiasts who spend their evenings picking through the wreckage of Cold War paranoia. They find memos about foreign elections. They find reports on chemical agents. They find thousands of documents that were once stamped with red ink and locked behind vault doors, now rendered as searchable PDFs, archived for public consumption. It is a remarkable thing when you think about it. The most powerful intelligence apparatus in human history, offering its secrets online, free of charge, sorted alphabetically, searchable by keyword. But here is the thing about a library that large. You can hide something in it. Not by removing it, not by burning it, not by reclassifying it after the fact or sending federal agents to confiscate the copies. You hide it by leaving it exactly where it is. Because if the truth sounds absurd enough, if it sits beside enough mundane paperwork, enough bureaucratic language, enough normal-sounding reports about weather patterns and agricultural output and foreign policy analysis, then the extraordinary file becomes invisible. Not because no one can read it, but because the moment they do, every reasonable instinct tells them to set it aside and move on. This is the story of one of those files, a remote viewing session from the late 1980s, a document that describes, in clinical intelligence language, the perceived location of the Ark of the Covenant, the most mythologized object in human religious history. But the Ark is not really what this story is about. This story is about what the viewer saw when they got there, and why the people running the program never wanted the session to end up where it did. Part 1. The document. The file appears in the database like any other. There is nothing extraordinary about its formatting, nothing alarming about its catalogue number, nothing in the metadata that would cause a researcher to slow down and look more closely, unless they already knew what they were looking for. It occupies the same digital shelf as thousands of other declassified documents from the intelligence community's more experimental Cold War programs. The programs that, for roughly 2 decades, attempted to answer a question so strange it still sounds like the premise of a bad science fiction film. Can the human mind perceive things it cannot see? Can consciousness, that strange, private, utterly unverifiable thing that lives behind your eyes, reach across distance and describe a location it has never physically visited? The official answer eventually was no, or rather, the results were inconclusive. The programs were expensive, and the Cold War was ending anyway. Better to quietly shut everything down, declassify the least sensitive material, and let historians sort through the wreckage. But the file about the Ark was never destroyed. It was archived, and a journalist named Elias Ward found it on a Tuesday night, 3 hours after he should have gone to bed, with a cold cup of coffee sitting on his desk and a browser tab open, to the Central Intelligence Agency's public reading room. Elias was not looking for anything supernatural. He was not a believer in psychic phenomena, not an enthusiast of fringe research, not the kind of person who cross-referenced Bible verses with satellite imagery for fun. He was, by his own description, a committed skeptic, someone who had spent years reporting on intelligence community overreach and Cold War-era government experimentation, and who had developed a particular interest in the gap between what agencies claimed their programs accomplished and what the internal documents actually showed. He was looking for that gap. He was always looking for that gap. And then he found the file. He read it once quickly, the way you read something when you expect it to be nothing. Then he closed the browser tab, sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he opened the browser tab again and read it much more slowly. The language was precise, clinical, written in the particular flattened style that intelligence documents use to describe extraordinary things in ordinary terms, as though the goal is to drain all the drama from a situation and leave only the structural bones of what was perceived, when and by whom. The document described a target that the viewer had been assigned without context, as was standard protocol in these sessions. The viewer had not been told what they were looking for. They were simply given coordinates, a string of numbers that correspond in the remote viewing framework to a specific target, and asked to describe what they perceived. What they described was this: a chamber, deeply underground, stone walls carved with rectilinear patterns, old enough that the carving style suggested a civilization that had long since disappeared from the historical record. The air in the chamber felt pressurized somehow, not in a way the viewer could explain precisely, but in a way that made the description feel less like imagination and more like sensation, like something that was being reported rather than invented. Inside the chamber, a rectangular object, wood, gold, elaborate ornamentation along all surfaces, two elongated carved figures mounted on the lid, facing inward toward each other, their forms stylized in a way that matched no specific tradition the viewer could name, but felt ancient in a way that bypassed analysis and went directly to something more instinctive. The viewer described figures, living, present, aware, standing in a configuration that did not look like guarding. It looked like attending, caring for something, the way you might care for something you believed was alive or dangerous or both. And then the viewer said something that the session handler tried, in the transcript, to redirect away from. The target is not alone, the target is aware. Not, there are guards here. Not, I sense other people in the room. The target itself, aware. The session became difficult after that point. The transcript shows a series of short exchanges, the handler attempting to refocus the viewer on physical descriptions, coordinates, architectural details. The viewer complying mostly, but returning again and again to the same theme. Something was present in the chamber that was not human, not architectural, not historical. Something that the viewer could not categorize using any framework they had available, and that disturbed them in a way that felt less like fear and more like recognition. The recognition of something so far outside normal experience that the mind cannot do anything useful with the information except report it and feel the edges of it slowly. The viewer's physiological data, pulse, respiration, galvanic skin response, showed significant elevation during this portion of the session. The session was terminated early. The file was archived. And now, decades later, a journalist was sitting in a small apartment with a cold cup of coffee, reading a document that the entire intelligence community had apparently decided was too strange to classify and too strange to ignore. Part 2: The Cold War Inside the Mind. To understand why this document exists at all, you need to understand the context that produced it. The 1960s and 70s were a strange time for science. Not strange in the way we usually mean, not the era of moon landings and mainframe computers and the accelerating triumph of rational inquiry. Strange in a different way, strange in the way that happens when rational inquiry starts asking questions it does not know how to answer, and the people doing the asking happen to work for agencies with essentially unlimited budgets and a pressing need to know everything their enemies know. The Soviet Union, intelligence reports suggested, was investing serious resources in what was then called psychotronics, the study of consciousness as a strategic tool, the possibility that the human mind, under the right conditions, could perceive information that should be physically inaccessible, could in theory describe the interior of a locked facility 10,000 miles away, or identify the contents of a sealed document, or locate a missing object using nothing but focused attention and practiced technique. This was not fringe material to the people reading those reports. This was a potential strategic gap. and the American intelligence community responded the way it always responds to potential strategic gaps. It funded research. The programs that emerged from this period went by various names over the years: Scanet, Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and finally, most famously, Stargate, the umbrella under which the entirety of American psychic intelligence research was consolidated before it was officially terminated in 1995. The people who ran these programs were not, by and large, true believers. They were analysts and contractors and researchers who had been handed an unusual assignment and were doing their best to apply rigorous methodology to a phenomenon that resisted rigorous methodology at every turn. They built protocols. They designed statistical tests. They brought in physicists and psychologists and neuroscientists to evaluate the results. They tried, as hard as they could, to determine whether what they were seeing in their best sessions was genuine anomalous cognition, or an extraordinarily elaborate form of self-deception. The honest answer, the answer that most of the senior researchers eventually landed on, was that they did not know. Some sessions produced results that were statistically unlikely enough to be interesting. Others produced nothing. The signal-to-noise ratio was poor. Replication was difficult. The phenomenon, if it was a phenomenon, was maddeningly inconsistent. But some viewers were better than others, significantly better, statistically, inexplicably, reproducibly better, in ways that made the program's more cautious researchers deeply uncomfortable. Because if the results were real, then something was happening that the scientific consensus of the time had no framework to explain. The viewer who conducted the ARC session was one of those viewers. Elias spent weeks trying to reconstruct this person's identity from the available record. The session documents used only a code designation, a string of letters and numbers that appeared in several other documents from the same general period, always attached to sessions that the internal reviewers had flagged as unusually detailed or unusually accurate. The viewer's civilian name was buried somewhere in the classified portions of the program record that had not been released. But from the fragments that were available, a portrait emerged. Someone who had come to the program from a military background. Someone who had, early in the research, shown results that were anomalous enough to attract the attention of senior program managers. Someone who had been quietly moved from training exercises to operational tasking. Real intelligence targets, real locations, real objects that the program's handlers wanted described from a distance. Someone who, at some point in the late 1980s, had been given a set of coordinates and a session number, and had sat down across from a handler and begun describing a chamber beneath the ground, in a region of the world that had, for thousands of years, held more religious and archaeological significance than almost anywhere else on Earth. Part 3. What the Ark actually was before the conspiracy, before the intelligence programs, before the remote viewing sessions and the classified archives and the shell-funded expeditions. There is the object itself, or rather, there is the idea of the object, which is all most people have ever had access to. The Ark of the Covenant appears in the Hebrew Bible as a container, specifically a rectangular box constructed from acacia wood, plated inside and out with pure gold, fitted with carrying poles slotted through golden rings at its base, and topped with a solid gold lid, the mercy seat, flanked by 2 golden cherubim whose wings arched inward to face each other across the top of the lid. Inside the Ark, according to various texts, were the stone tablets on which the 10 Commandments were inscribed, possibly also the rod of Aaron, possibly also a container of manna from the wilderness. The precise contents varied depending on which tradition you consulted and which period of the text you were reading. The Ark was, in its theological framing, the dwelling place of the divine presence. The Israelites carried it before them in battle. They placed it at the centre of their ritual life. They surrounded its maintenance with an elaborate system of priesthood and protocol. Specific bloodlines, specific rituals, specific rules about who could approach it, touch it, or even look at it directly. The rules about looking at it directly are worth pausing on, because they are extremely specific, not just that looking was forbidden, but that exposure, being in the wrong relationship to the Ark, approaching it without proper preparation, touching it without authorization, resulted in death. Not symbolic death, not spiritual death, actual, physical, immediate death. The Hebrew Bible contains several accounts of this. A man named Uzzah reaching out to steady the Ark as it tilted on a cart, and dying instantly, text says, for the transgression of touching it. 70 men of Beth Shemesh reportedly dying after looking inside the Ark. The Philistines, after capturing the Ark during a military campaign, suffering waves of illness and plague across every city where the object was housed until they finally sent it back. These stories are ancient. They have been interpreted symbolically for millennia as parables about approaching the sacred with proper reverence, about the danger of casual contact with the divine. But Elias was no longer reading them symbolically. He was reading them as data, because the pattern that emerges when you strip away the theological framing and look at only the physical descriptions is deeply strange. Bright light, sudden violent death, illness that spread outward from the object's location, overwhelming fear in people who approached it, psychological disturbance in those who spent extended time near it, a sustained field of influence that seemed to extend beyond physical contact, affecting people and spaces in its proximity even without direct touch. If you describe those effects to a modern physicist without telling them the source, they would likely suggest several possible mechanisms: electromagnetic radiation, intense electrical discharge, some form of ionizing radiation, possibly a mechanism involving high-frequency sound that could cause physiological distress in the human body. Ancient people, of course, had none of those frameworks available to them. What they had was religion, and so they built the most sophisticated religious containment protocol the ancient world ever produced, surrounding this object with layers of ritual and restriction and priesthood, limiting access to the most carefully prepared individuals, developing generational traditions around the safe maintenance of something they understood as divine but may have been describing in the only vocabulary they had. The theologians in the room will object at this point, and fairly. The text is sacred to billions of people, and reducing the Ark of the Covenant to a physics problem is not a neutral act. But we are not making a theological argument. We're tracing a conspiracy theory. And the conspiracy theory asks a very specific question. What if the ancient descriptions were accurate, and the Ark was a real object with measurable physical properties, and the religious framework built around it was simply the only language available to people trying to manage something they could not explain? And if that is true, what might modern governments do if they believed they had located it? Part 4. The Geography of Obsession. The Ark disappears from the historical record with a completeness that has occupied historians and archaeologists and religious scholars for centuries. The last clear textual reference to its presence in the Jerusalem temple is before the Babylonian destruction. After that, silence. The object that the entire religious and military life of an ancient civilization had organized itself around simply vanishes from the record, and the historical debate about where it went has been running, without resolution, ever since. The candidates are numerous. Ethiopia claims it with particular force. The city of Axum has maintained for centuries that the Ark rests in a church called the Chapel of the Tablet, guarded by a single monk whose entire life is dedicated to its protection, and who is forbidden from leaving the chapel's grounds for the duration of his appointment. Ethiopian Orthodox tradition holds this claim with complete seriousness, and no outside researcher, archaeologist, or journalist has ever been granted access to verify or disprove it. Egypt is another candidate. Some researchers have pointed to archaeological evidence suggesting a priestly community in Egypt during the period when the Ark disappeared from the Jerusalem record, a community that may have carried significant religious objects with them. The location of Elephantine, a Jewish military colony on an island in the Nile near modern Aswan, has attracted particular attention, though the evidence remains circumstantial. Jordan, Israel itself, Sudan, the caves and chambers and underground complexes of a region that has been continuously inhabited, fought over, excavated and obsessively documented for thousands of years, and that still, somehow, holds secrets that even modern technology has not fully exposed. The Vatican receives a mention in most versions of this conspiracy, and it is worth pausing on why. The Vatican Library is one of the most restricted archival institutions in the world. It contains approximately 85,000 manuscripts, over 1 million printed books, and an unknown quantity of classified material that has never been publicly catalogued. Scholars who have been granted access to portions of it describe an institution of staggering depth and extraordinary discretion. What is in the most restricted sections is not publicly known, and the Vatican has not made transparency a priority. But the conspiracy theory is less interested in what the Vatican knows than in what it has historically done with that knowledge. Intelligence agencies and religious institutions, the theory suggests, are not as separate as they present themselves. Both are in the business of information. Both have long institutional memories. Both understand that certain kinds of knowledge are more valuable when held quietly than when announced publicly. And during the 20th century, as Western intelligence agencies developed increasingly sophisticated archaeological and historical research capabilities, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, access to classified geological surveys, certain informal channels of coordination with institutions that had been tracking the same questions for centuries became, the theory holds, operationally useful. Not a formal partnership, not a treaty, or a joint venture, or a signed agreement. Just a mutual understanding between two very old institutions that some questions are better pursued quietly. Part 5. The expeditions that never happened. Military contractors do not usually discuss the work they did during the Cold War. This is partly legal. Non-disclosure agreements that extend well beyond any reasonable active service period. Partly institutional, a culture of discretion that runs so deep it becomes indistinguishable from identity, and partly something harder to name, a reluctance to describe certain things, not because you have been told not to, but because you have learned that certain descriptions invite certain reactions, and the reactions are not worth the conversation. Elias found one of them. A retired contractor, 60s, former logistics and support background. Someone who had spent time in the late Cold War years handling the practical infrastructure of operations that were never listed in any official record. Transportation, supply chains, the particular kind of paperwork that exists to obscure the non-existence of the thing it documents. The man did not want to talk on the record. He did not want to talk at all at first. He had spent 30 years not talking, and the habit was deep. But he had also spent 30 years watching a story not get told, and there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from that. He described, in careful and indirect language, a series of expeditions that took place in the late 1980s and very early 90s. Not large operations, small teams, 4 to 6 people, specialists, someone with geological and underground survey expertise, someone with cultural and historical knowledge of the target region, someone with security and communications, and at least one person whose role the contractor described only as the reader. He used that word carefully. He let it sit in the air for a moment. Then he moved on. The target regions were in northeastern Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. The expeditions moved through areas that were officially off limits for various political and security reasons. The logistics of getting people into those areas without documentation, without official sanction, and without leaving a traceable record required exactly the kind of infrastructure the contractor had spent his career building. The teams went in. Some came back. The contractor paused at that point. Some came back, he said again. He would not say more about the ones who did not. The mission objective, as it had been described to him in the euphemistic language that operations like this required, was artifact verification. Whether a specific historical object was present at a specific location, and if so, what its current condition and accessibility were. The object was never named in any paperwork he had seen, but the operational profile, the security level, the team composition, the specific expertise required, the level of institutional attention paid to the results, suggested that whatever they were looking for was not a routine archaeological curiosity. He had always assumed it was something that had belonged to one government and had been lost when that government fell. A weapon, a technology, something finite and comprehensible. It was only later, after the official programs had been shut down and the first wave of declassifications had produced documents he had never expected to see, that he had started to reconsider what exactly the teams had been looking for, and whether finding it, or getting close to it, was what had caused certain members of certain teams to come back from the desert, changed in ways that nobody in the program wanted to discuss. Part 6. The Containment Theory. The mainstream archaeological consensus treats the Ark as a lost religious artifact. The religious consensus treats it as a sacred object whose location is either known to God or preserved through divine protection until the appropriate moment of revelation. The conspiracy theory treats it as a containment problem. This is the shift at the centre of the Project Sunbox narrative, and it is worth slowing down to examine it carefully, because it is where the story stops being merely strange and becomes genuinely disturbing. If the ancient Israelite priesthood was functionally a containment and management protocol, if the elaborate ritual system surrounding the Ark was not primarily about worship, but about safe handling of an object with dangerous properties, then the disappearance of the Ark is not a mystery of loss. It is a mystery of relocation. The ancient priests did not fail to protect the Ark from the Babylonians. They moved it before the Babylonians arrived. They moved it to a location they had prepared, through pre-existing channels they had been maintaining, in coordination with a small number of trusted specialists who understood what the object required and what it was capable of. And then they built a cover story. Not a malicious cover story, not a deliberate deception, but the kind of cover story that emerges naturally when the truth is so far outside the available cultural vocabulary that the most honest translation you can produce is myth. You describe the object as divine because that is the closest word you have for something that operates by rules you cannot explain. You describe its keepers as priests because that is the closest institutional framework you have for people who maintain strict generationally transmitted protocols around a dangerous thing. You describe the rituals as worship because the protocols look like worship from the outside, and because the people performing them have, over generations, genuinely come to understand them in those terms. The truth, the pre-theological truth, if such a thing can be reconstructed at this distance, might have been simpler and more terrifying. Here is an object that kills people who approach it incorrectly. Here is what correct approach looks like. Pass this knowledge on. Do not let the object be found by anyone who does not have the knowledge, because the alternative, the object in the hands of someone who does not know what it is, or who thinks they know what it is and are wrong, or who knows exactly what it is and wants to use it, is catastrophic in a way that the ancient priesthood apparently considered serious enough to build civilizational infrastructure around preventing. The remote viewer in the Central Intelligence Agency session did not know any of this history when they sat down to describe what they perceived. They had not been briefed on the Ark of the Covenant. They had not been given context, location, religious background, or any framework for interpreting what they would find at the coordinates they had been assigned. And yet the session transcript contains a line that the containment theory would suggest is the most important thing in the entire document. It is not meant to be opened. The viewer said this during a period of high physiological distress. The handler attempted to move on. The viewer returned to it. Not, it is locked. Not, I cannot open it. Not, the guards will not allow it. It is not meant to be opened. The distinction is significant. A lock is a mechanical fact. A prohibition is a human choice. But the construction the viewer used suggests something different. A property intrinsic to the object itself, not a restriction imposed from outside, but a quality built in, as fundamental as the object's dimensions or its material composition. As though whoever made it had also made the understanding that it should not be opened into something the object itself communicated. Part 7. Project Sunbox. The official termination of the Stargate project in 1995 was, as far as the public record is concerned, the end of American government interest in psychic intelligence research. The program had produced inconclusive results. The Cold War rationale for maintaining it had dissolved. The classified budget could be redirected toward more conventional intelligence methods that did not require defending against the category of skepticism that remote viewing attracted whenever it became known to exist. The official history is tidy and final, but official histories are written to be public, and some programs are built to survive the writing of official histories. The theory of Project Sunbox begins with a specific premise, that in the final years of the Stargate program, a small subset of the program's most operationally valuable research was separated from the main archive and moved into a compartmentalized structure that had no official designation, no budget line that could be traced through normal oversight channels, and no personnel list that existed in any unclassified document. Not because the research had been abandoned, because it had finally produced something actionable. The Stargate program, in its public history, was a broad-based investigation into the general phenomenon of anomalous cognition. The question of whether psychic perception existed as a general human capability. Most of the research existed at that level of generality. Statistical studies, training programs, theoretical frameworks for understanding what might be happening if the results were real. But within the program, apparently, a narrower and more specific research strand had developed. Not, can humans perceive things at a distance, but can humans perceive specific categories of objects at a distance, and do certain objects respond differently to remote perception than others? The answer, according to the internal research that never made it into the declassified record, was apparently yes. Certain objects, particularly objects with certain material compositions and certain historical profiles, appeared to produce sessions that were dramatically more consistent, more detailed, and more physically distressing to the viewer than sessions targeting ordinary locations or neutral objects. The pattern was noted, it was studied, and at some point a senior researcher in the program whose name does not appear in any declassified document apparently wrote a memo suggesting that the phenomenon was not a feature of the viewers but of the targets, that certain objects possessed properties that made them more detectable, in some sense, than others, and the object that produced the most consistent, most detailed, and most consistently disturbing sessions across multiple viewers operating independently of each other was a target identified in the internal system as Sunbox, the Ark. Project Sunbox was not a research program about psychic phenomena. It was a logistics and location program whose goal was to find a specific object, verify its current containment status, and assess whether intervention, retrieval, relocation, additional containment was advisable given the intelligence community's evolving understanding of what the object might be and what it might be capable of. The remote viewing component was one of several intelligence methodologies applied to the problem. Satellite imagery, archaeological consultants, engagement with certain religious institutions through back channels, analysis of historical records from multiple traditions, ground-penetrating radar surveys of several candidate sites conducted under cover of legitimate archaeological projects. The program ran, by Elias Ward's reconstruction, for approximately 12 years after the official shutdown of Stargate. Whether it was ever formally terminated is unknown. Whether it found what it was looking for is unknown. Whether the answer to that question is good news or very bad news is perhaps the central question of the entire story. Part 8. The Chamber. Elias Ward went to northeastern Africa. He told almost no one. He left almost no record of the decision, which was partly practical and partly something he could not fully articulate. A sense that announcing the journey in advance would change its character, in some way he did not want to risk. He travelled with a small group assembled through the kinds of connections that investigative journalists develop over years. A former geological survey specialist who had worked in the region, an archaeologist with experience in underground structures, a security consultant with regional contacts. None of them were told the specific nature of what they were looking for. Elias told them only that he had reason to believe there was an underground structure in the area that had not been formally surveyed, and that he wanted to see it. The region was not easy terrain. The landscape was old in the specific way that places become old when they have been continuously inhabited, contested, abandoned, and re-inhabited across spans of time that make recorded history feel recent. There was a texture to the ground itself, in the way the soil layered, in the way the stone showed different strata, that suggested everything visible was built on top of something older, which was built on top of something older still. They found the entrance on the third day. It was not what Elias had expected. He had been imagining something that looked ancient from the outside. Carved stone, obvious antiquity, the visual grammar of an archaeological site. But the entrance looked engineered in a way that was harder to date. The stonework showed techniques from multiple periods overlapping each other, as though the site had been maintained, modified, and maintained again across a very long span of time, each iteration adding something without removing the layers beneath. The air inside was different. Not colder exactly, though the temperature dropped. Different in a way that the former geological specialist, who had spent years in caves and underground structures across multiple continents, said he had never encountered before. Dense, somehow. As though the air itself had a quality that normal air did not. The compasses drifted. This is a thing that happens in certain geological formations, magnetite deposits in the surrounding rock, specific orientations of iron-bearing minerals, and the specialist noted it and made it technically explicable, though the explanation did not quite settle the feeling the drift produced. Electronics worked inconsistently. Again, technically explicable. Electromagnetic interference from geological sources, possibly residual effects from certain mineral compositions in the surrounding stone, technically explicable. But the explanations kept arriving after the effects, which is not quite how explanation is supposed to work. The deeper they went, the more consistent the effects became. Elias became aware at some point of a low-frequency quality to the air. Not quite sound, not quite vibration. Something in the boundary between the two that the body registered before the mind could categorize it. The archaeologist described it later, in notes he shared with Elias weeks after the expedition, as a feeling of being addressed. Not spoken to, addressed. The distinction seemed important to him, though he could not say precisely why. Elias had no such poetic language for what he experienced. He noted three things. A persistent reluctance to move deeper that felt different from ordinary fear. A quality of attention to the space, as though the space was aware of being entered. That he could not explain as architectural, and a visual phenomenon in his peripheral vision that stopped when he looked directly at it, but had a quality of consistency, of regularity, that random visual artifacts do not usually have. They reached the chamber on the 5th day of the descent. Part 9. What Elias found. The chamber was sealed. Not sealed in the way of a collapsed tunnel or a door that had been shut for millennia and fused with time. Sealed in a specific, deliberate, engineered way, with joints that showed evidence of repeated opening and resealing, with channels carved into the surrounding stone that the geologist identified, after a long examination, as ventilation structures of unusual sophistication, with a surface texture on the sealing materials that suggested they had been prepared with something in mind other than permanence. This was not a burial, this was a maintenance protocol. The carvings on the walls outside the sealed entrance were from multiple periods. The archaeologist spent 2 full hours on them and emerged pale and unusually quiet. They overlapped in ways that made comprehensive translation impossible. Different scripts, different symbol systems, different traditions that should not, given their conventional dating, have been in the same place, as though the space had attracted record keepers across an enormous span of time, each one adding to a document that none of them could read in its entirety. One section was clearer than the others. The archaeologist, after sitting with it for a long time, offered a tentative translation. The language was a form of Semitic writing from roughly the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, heavily damaged, with gaps she could only approximate. What she could read translated roughly as this: "What rests here speaks through what the mind cannot hold. It speaks through fear because fear is the closest word. The keepers who came before us kept it by keeping themselves. Those who forgot to keep themselves did not return." The word she translated as keep appeared to carry a doubled meaning in the original, both to guard and to maintain, in the sense of maintaining a specific internal state. The keeping of the object, the ancient inscription suggested, was inseparable from the keeping of oneself. Elias sat with this for a long time. Then he thought about the remote viewer in the 1980s, thousands of miles away, describing a chamber they had never physically visited, their pulse elevated, their hands sweating, their voice tightening around a word they repeated and kept returning to. Not meant to be opened. The team did not open the chamber. Partly practical, they had no tools for the specific kind of sealing they found, and the geologist advised strongly against any attempt to force it. Partly something less practical, a consensus that had formed without being explicitly discussed, a shared understanding that encountering a threshold and not crossing it was the correct response to what they had found. They documented what they could. They left the way they had come. The effects diminished as they ascended. By the time they reached the surface, the compasses worked normally, the electronics were stable, and the specific quality of the air was gone, replaced by the ordinary, uncomplicated sensation of breathing in an open landscape under a sky that offered no particular commentary on what existed below it. Elias filed no story. Part 10. The Architecture of the Cover-Up. The most elegant cover-up in history does not require active maintenance. The cover-up that requires agents in the field, documents destroyed, witnesses silenced, whistleblowers disappeared, that kind of cover-up is expensive, fragile, and perpetually at risk of unravelling, because it requires ongoing human effort, and human beings are unreliable at scale. The elegant cover-up runs itself. You leave the document in the reading room. You let the search engine index it. You allow it to be found by anyone who looks. You rely instead on the thing that is more powerful than any active suppression mechanism ever devised: the sociology of plausibility. A document that describes a CIA remote viewing session targeting the Ark of the Covenant, archived publicly among thousands of other declassified files, does not require redaction. It does not require a special handler or a monitoring program, or an alert flag on the accounts of researchers who download it. It requires only that the world continue to operate as it normally does, which is to say that the distance between what is documented and what most people are willing to believe continues to be roughly what it has always been. The person who reads the file and finds it interesting will tell someone else about it. That person will raise an eyebrow and change the subject. The information will be received as one of those things that people with too much time and an excessive fondness for rabbit holes occupy themselves with, and the world will gently and cheerfully redirect toward more tractable questions. This is not a conspiracy. This is sociology. And Elias Ward understood, sitting at his desk with a cold cup of coffee and an open browser tab, that the most efficient response to a truth that sounds insane is not erasure. It is patience. You wait for the world to dismiss it. You archive it in plain sight. You rely on the reasonable, sensible, entirely understandable tendency of the human mind to stop before the edge of the truly strange and say, "Surely not. Surely this is not what it appears to be. Surely there is a more ordinary explanation." Because there usually is, except when there isn't. Part 11. The Nature of What Remains. Elias Ward returned from northeastern Africa and did not file a story. He returned to his desk. He returned to his browser. He returned to the Central Intelligence Agency reading room, where the document was still there, still indexed, still searchable, still quietly archived between files about something else entirely on either side. He read it a third time. He had read it before as a skeptic looking for a debunk. He had read it after as a researcher looking for connections. He read it now as someone who had been underground in the dark and felt the air change. and stood before a sealed door that had been opened and resealed an unknowable number of times across an unknowable span of human history. The viewer's words looked different from this vantage point. Not more supernatural, not more mystical, more technical actually. More like the report of someone who had encountered a real phenomenon and was doing their best with the vocabulary available in a setting that did not reward the kind of language the phenomenon seemed to require. The target is protected by entities. An entity is simply a thing that exists. In technical language, it carries no supernatural freight. The viewer, struggling to categorize what they perceived, chose the most neutral word available for a presence they could not classify using any framework they had been provided. It is not meant to be opened. A design specification, a property, the statement of someone perceiving something about the object's fundamental nature rather than a restriction imposed from outside. The target is aware, the strangest line, the one the handler most urgently tried to redirect, the one the viewer returned to again when the handler's redirection failed. Elias sat with this for a long time. He had spent his career in the gap between what agencies claimed and what documents showed. He had learned, over years, that the most significant information rarely resided in the explicit content of any given document, but in the negative space around it, in the questions that were not asked, the topics that were not pursued, the lines of inquiry that stopped just short of the thing they were approaching. The ARC session ended early. This was unusual. Most sessions in the program were allowed to run their full duration, even when the viewer was struggling or the information was not useful. The handlers were instructed to keep sessions going, to redirect rather than terminate, to extract maximum usable data from each session, regardless of how the viewer was performing. This session was terminated early, and then archived, and then the program that produced it was officially shut down, and then a different, smaller, compartmentalized program with no official name began, and then, somewhere in northeastern Africa, in an underground chamber that had been opened and resealed across thousands of years of human history, something continued to exist in a sealed room, attended by mechanisms of protection that no longer required anyone to maintain them, or perhaps did. Perhaps maintenance was ongoing. Perhaps Project Sunbox was not trying to find the Ark. Perhaps it was trying to ensure the Ark was still where it needed to be. And perhaps the expeditions that entered those regions and did not all come back had simply gotten too close to something that the ancient inscription, in its damaged and overlapping script, had tried to warn them about. Keep yourselves, so that you can keep it. Those who forgot did not return.